Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of the Big Fat White Guy. And for today, we are going to talk about mmm, lechon. Now, the problem here in America is we do not have, the proper permits to just be getting the whole pig in order to roast it as, your typical lechon with crackling skin. Thank God, however, we're still able to get pieces of meat that still have skin on. After all, what is lechon without the crispy, crackly skin that you can dip in liver sauce? Of course, I already told you that the other problem is we do not get whole hogs here unless you know your local favorite butcher who's going to get it for you. Anyway, for today, we're going to talk about how to transform this lovely piece of meat into your crispy, crackly, juicy lechon. Now, what we have here is 9.06 pounds of pork. Skin on, it's actually a pork shoulder, and that roughly translates to something like 4.11 kilograms. I actually did my math earlier on. The biggest or the best friend that you have in order to make this piece of meat transform to its crackly state is salt. Salt is actually the dehydrating agent that gets all the liquids out of the skin and all that in order for you to really put it under high heat and change its character to this crackly piece of skin that you wanted in lechon. Of course, with that, you need to have the following stuff. Here is what we have is a jelly roll pan. A jelly roll pan, that's like it also you need to have to catch all the drippings, and therefore you also need to have this wire rack. The wire rack sits on top of the jelly roll pan, like so. Now, the other thing that you also need to have is aluminum foil. Two things about aluminum foil. There's schools of thought on how to cook lechon. For one thing, in the Philippines, we actually do it as rotisserie style outside the house, over hot coals. And with the environment being open, of course it's hot within, but of course when the wind blows, the temperature somewhat dissipates a little bit and goes back up, but it's more or less like constant. And at the site where the meat rests in between the two lines of charcoal. So in order to preserve that kind of constant temperature high, but at the same time you don't want it to be too high that it dries your meat thoroughly, or else yes, you may have crackly skin, but then the problem is that your meat will be so dry underneath that it's unpleasant to eat. So first school of thought is that you may want to use your aluminum foil to wrap the meat as it gently roasts constant temperature, high temperature, in order to have the meat juices cook the meat from within, and then you preserve all that juice so that it doesn't make your meat very dry. The other is, of course, to just let it hang out in the open, but you risk doing that. And besides, yeah, you may probably get your crappy skin. But I'll show you, however, that you can actually have the same kind of like really juicy, juicy meat within at the final minutes of the cooking. Now, of course, the other purpose of your aluminum foil is to, of course, wrap your jelly roll pan for easy cooking. So, the ingredients are simple, the technique is where it's at. Anyway, that's it. So now let's proceed to how to make your perfect lechon. Okay, so now we have this jelly roll pan that has been lined with your aluminum foil, and you have your wire rack sitting on top. You first get your meat, and then of course remove it from the. Now you will notice that the meat is a bit wet, of course, so you have to wipe all the wetness away. Now, wetness is actually what prevents the skin from being crackly. Secondly, is of course the lack of exposure to the heat. So with that said, usually what I do is I um, get a very sharp pair of scissors and try to expose the skin as much as possible. See these crevices right here? Now, you can expose that further by somewhat clipping it on the sides and lifting it up, somewhat like doing a dissection. Okay. And you do that also on the other side here. Of course, you don't need to do this if you have a whole roaster with all the skin already exposed. Pieces of meat that are like that are like pork bellies, but this one is a pork shoulder, and of course you get the shoulder and you have the skin kind of like enveloping around the whole pork extremity. So that's how you do it. Now, with that, you will notice that it gets a bit wet again. And as I've said, the reason why pork or the pork skin does not get crispy is wetness, which is of course inherent in the meat. Now, wiping it again, you get a sharp knife, or if you have a sharp fork, you put some puncture the meat all over. But then I don't have a very sharp fork, so I could use a sharp lancet instead. And what you can do is to just sort of like run this way. What this does is that it creates increased surface area for the juices, at least on the skin, to be exposed to the surface. Because when you have an intact skin like that, you don't have these holes that you create with your fork or with your lancet, that all the water is still retained within the skin. You need to expose all that water, and so doing this will facilitate that process. Okay, so we're done puncturing the surface of the skin. You will notice that once you've done your puncturing, more of the liquids or the meat juices will actually come out of the holes, the puncture holes. And that's good, because in order to really bring that out, the next step is to put or rub it with a lot of salt. So you get your rock salt and just rub. And the more salt that you will get, that you put, the more water that you will get out of the skin, and it helps with the dehydrating process. In fact, once I put the salt, you will see closely that you will develop these pockets of droplets of water at the puncture sites. So that is brought about by the salt, because salt attracts water. So you put salt on the surface, and of course it acts as your salting agent. That's what salt is. And so you can also turn your meat the other way and you salt it as well. Okay? You will notice that once you're done putting the salt, that the meat becomes wet, so wet that you need to wipe it again and again. Now, you leave this alone for about 30 minutes to an hour or so, and you may want to wipe it again and again, just to get rid of the water. But the water will just most likely sort of like drip towards the sides and be caught by your pan. You will roast the pork shoulder actually using the same pan anyway. Um, but as you can see, the surface of the uh, pork shoulder now begins to get wet as a result of the puncture, the puncturing process plus the salt that you've just put on the surface. So we go back to this later as we're going to put it in the oven as we also wipe this regularly, to get rid of water. After an hour of resting, and I added more salt on the surface of the pork a while ago, you will notice that there's a lot of wetness surrounding the salt particles, as well as the salt still there. It continues to get the liquids from underneath, especially where the increased surface area is, the areas of puncture. So this is probably ready for roasting. In order to preserve the juices of the pork underneath, as you continue to get the juices from the surface of the skin and continues to dehydrate with the use of the salt, I would cover this with aluminum foil. Now, the reason for the aluminum foil is to keep the roast juicy as it cooks in the oven. And the thing is, the basic rule of thumb in order to cook meat is 20 minutes per pound. So since this is 9 pounds, 9 pounds multiplied by 20 minutes gives you more or less 3 hours of cooking time. So I will be roasting this probably for the next 2.5 hours covered. With this, the pork cooks, and from within, all the juices continue to be preserved. However, the liquids on the surface of the skin are continued to be attracted to the salt, thereby dehydrating the surface. Meanwhile, the inside of it remains to be juicy because you have actually kept the moisture within the aluminum foil. So in this setup, I'm going to put this in the oven for the next 2.5 hours, as I've said, and I'll see you, to check on this thing later. So this thing has been cooking for about 2.5 hours in 400 degrees Fahrenheit using a convection oven. Convection oven meaning that there's an electric fan inside spreading all that hot air around. And 2.5 hours later, this is what we get. So we still have the whole thing covered in aluminum foil. And as you can see, once we remove it, okay, it's more or less very dry here, but still soft, okay? But this is how you actually start the process of making very good crackly skin. Now, with that, you remove some of the excess salt, which has actually removed or attracted all the water underneath from all the pores that we have earlier put in using your knife or your very sharp fork. Using a little bit of cooking oil, we pour some cooking oil on top, and your brush, there you go, you have to spread a little bit of oil. Now, using the same temperature, 400 degrees Fahrenheit, we leave this to further bake, and this time with the aluminum foil off, so that we can expose all that skin to the convection hot air, and this will now begin to do the crackling process, which will be somewhat like similar to your chicharron, but not quite. You don't want it to be too high of a temperature to make it really appear crackly, bubbly skin, but just so to dehydrate it further and make it into a skin that's just well dehydrated, and it will become soft at first, and then will become crunchy and crispy as the temperature gets lower and as the meat gets a little bit on the colder side. So we'll come back to this later and then we'll see what happens. 30 minutes later at 400 degrees oven. Um, Now this is a 3-hour roast, and without the cover for the last 30 minutes. As you can see, it's now beginning to crackle right here, a little bit soft still here. Now, you may want to increase the oven temperature, the purpose of which is just to crackle the skin a bit, but you don't want it to be over crackled, looking like chicharrones or the pork cracklings. You want it to be crispy, but still with the semblance of skin. So the 400 degree oven, here we are going to probably put it at around 500 or even broil, but I'll do a 500 instead. So we change to 500 and then start. So we're going to watch this for about 15 minutes or so, and you will see it to begin to become more crispy, but as I've said, not crackly, overly crackly like a chicharrones. Okay, we'll come back to this later. 10 minutes after being put on a 500 degree oven, this is what we get. So you can see now the fat is really really sizzling, and here you can see that the skin is really crackly. So at this point you turn off the oven and leave it to cool like so. Okay, probably like until a bit almost room temperature. Not really room temperature, just hot. You know what I mean? Okay, the purpose of this is just for the meat to begin, begin to dehydrate further, and with the softness of the skin during when it's hot. As it begins to lower the temperature, then it begins to solidify, meaning that the gelatin inside the skin begins to become more gel-like, and at the same time solid in its goes back to its solid phase. This is what you want in making the skin crispy and all that. So there you have it. Once this is actually warm and ready to eat and ready to be sliced and put into several pieces, this is basically the chicharron or the lechon that you want to serve to your guests.